The evangelical ministry of His Holiness stood as a beacon of hope in the heart of South Los Angeles. Its pristine white walls and towering steeple reached towards the heavens, a stark contrast to the gritty urban landscape surrounding it. For years, it had been a sanctuary for the faithful, a place where dreams were nurtured and souls found solace. But on a sweltering summer night in 2023, this house of worship became the stage for a horrifying act that would shake the community to its core. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the church's manicured lawn, no one could have predicted the darkness that was about to engulf the lives of Pastor Anselm Johnson, his pregnant wife Sarah, and his cousin Job. The events that unfolded on that fateful night would forever change the face of the evangelical ministry of His Holiness and leave an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of Los Angeles. Anselm Johnson wasn't born into the clergy. His path to the pulpit was paved with struggle, determination, and what many in his congregation would call divine intervention. Growing up in the tough neighborhoods of South Central, young Anselm had seen his fair share of violence and despair. His father, a dock worker, struggled with alcoholism, while his mother worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table for Anselm and his 4 siblings. Despite the hardships, Anselm found solace in the local church. It was there, amidst the soulful hymns and fiery sermons, that he discovered his calling. The charismatic preachers who graced the pulpit each Sunday became his role models, their words a lifeline in a sea of adversity. By the time he reached his late teens, Anselm had become a fixture in the church community. His natural charm and gift for public speaking caught the attention of Pastor Gregory Williams, an influential figure in the Los Angeles religious scene. Under Williams' mentorship, Anselm's faith deepened and his ambitions grew. "That boy's got the fire of the Holy Spirit in him," Pastor Williams would often say, his eyes twinkling with pride. "Mark my words, he's going places." And go places he did. Anselm threw himself into his studies, earning a scholarship to a prestigious theological seminary. His dedication was unwavering, his focus laser-sharp. While other students partied and explored the temptations of youth, Anselm could be found in the library, poring over religious texts late into the night. It was during this time that Anselm met Sarah. She was a vision of grace and beauty, a fellow seminary student with a voice that could make angels weep. Their courtship was swift and passionate, a whirlwind romance that seemed blessed by God Himself. Within a year of meeting, they were married in a lavish ceremony that drew the who's who of the Los Angeles religious community. "Sarah and I, we're going to change the world," Anselm would say, his arm wrapped lovingly around his new bride. "With God's guidance and each other's support, there's nothing we can't accomplish." Fresh out of seminary, armed with a degree and burning ambition, Anselm set his sights on building his own ministry. He and Sarah started small, holding services in community centers and school auditoriums. But Anselm's magnetic personality and Sarah's angelic voice soon drew crowds. Their following grew rapidly, and before long, they had raised enough funds to break ground on what would become the evangelical ministry of His Holiness. The church rose from the ground like a modern-day miracle. Its sleek design and state-of-the-art facilities were a far cry from the humble chapels of Anselm's youth. On the day of its grand opening, the pews were packed to capacity, with people spilling out onto the streets. "This is not just a building," Anselm declared from the pulpit, his voice ringing with emotion. "This is a home for the lost, a refuge for the weary, and a launching pad for God's work in our community." The congregation erupted in cheers and amens. Sarah stood by his side, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. It seemed that the Johnsons had achieved their dream, creating a thriving ministry that would serve as a beacon of hope for generations to come. As the years passed, the evangelical ministry of His Holiness flourished under Anselm's leadership. His sermons, a potent mix of old-school fire and brimstone and modern self-help philosophy, drew people from all walks of life. The church's outreach programs became a lifeline for the community, offering everything from food banks to job training. Anselm and Sarah became celebrities in their own right. They were fixtures on local television, their faces adorning billboards across the city. Los Angeles power couple for Christ, the media dubbed them. Their influence extended beyond the church walls, with Anselm often rubbing shoulders with local politicians and business leaders. But as the saying goes, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. And for Pastor Anselm Johnson, the fall would be spectacular and devastating. On the surface, the Johnsons seemed to have it all. A thriving ministry, adoring followers, and a marriage that was the envy of their congregation. But beneath the polished veneer, cracks were beginning to form. The pressure of maintaining their public image was taking its toll. Anselm's workdays grew longer, his time at home increasingly rare. Sarah, once his equal partner in ministry, found herself relegated to the sidelines, her role reduced to that of the smiling, supportive wife. "I just wish he'd talk to me like he used to," Sarah confided to her best friend and fellow church member Lena. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living with a stranger." Lena patted her hand sympathetically. "Girl, you know how men get when they taste success. Give him time, he'll come around." But time only seemed to widen the gulf between them. Anselm's sermons began to focus more on prosperity and success, less on love and compassion. The humble preacher, who had once connected so deeply with his flock, was slowly being replaced by a slick, ambitious televangelist. It was during this tumultuous time that Job Johnson, Anselm's cousin, re-entered their lives. Job had always been the black sheep of the family, drifting from job to job, never quite finding his place in the world. But now he claimed he had found God and wanted to turn his life around. "'Cause I've seen the light," Job told Anselm over dinner one evening. "I want to do right by the Lord, and I figured, who better to guide me than you?" Anselm, always one to believe in the power of redemption, welcomed Job with open arms. He offered him a job at the church, managing the food bank and other outreach programs. Sarah, starved for companionship, found in Job a sympathetic ear and a link to the Anselm she once knew. As the weeks turned into months, Job became an increasingly common presence in the Johnson household. He was there for family dinners, church events, and quiet evenings at home. While Anselm buried himself in work, Job and Sarah found themselves drawn to each other, bonding over shared memories and mutual understanding. "You remind me so much of Anselm when we first met," Sarah told Job one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, full of passion and purpose. Job's hand brushed against hers, lingering for a moment too long. "He's a lucky man," he said softly, his eyes never leaving her face. The tension between them was palpable, a dangerous undercurrent threatening to sweep them both away. But for now, they resisted, clinging to their faith and their loyalty to Anselm. Meanwhile, Anselm remained oblivious to the growing connection between his wife and his cousin. His mind was consumed with grander visions. He had recently been approached by a group of investors interested in taking the evangelical ministry of His Holiness National. The prospect of expanding his reach, of touching even more lives with his message, was intoxicating. "Can you imagine it, Sarah?" he said excitedly one night, pacing the living room. "Our ministry in every major city in America. We could change the face of Christianity in this country." Sarah forced a smile, but her heart wasn't in it. "That sounds ambitious," she said carefully. "But what about our community here? Don't they need us?" Anselm waved off her concerns. "We'll always have a presence here. But think bigger, honey. This is our chance to really make a difference." As Anselm's dreams grew, so did the distance between him and Sarah. She found herself turning more and more to Job for comfort and understanding. The lines of propriety began to blur, their relationship teetering on the edge of something more than friendship. It was a powder keg waiting to explode, and the fuse was already lit. The summer heat in Los Angeles was oppressive, seeming to amplify the tensions simmering beneath the surface of the Johnson household. Sarah, now 5 months pregnant, found herself increasingly isolated. Anselm's absences had become the norm rather than the exception, his mind consumed with plans for the ministry's expansion. On a particularly stifling afternoon, Sarah sat alone in the church office, sorting through donation receipts. The air conditioning hummed softly, providing little relief from the heat or her troubled thoughts. The door creaked open, and Job stepped in, his forehead glistening with sweat. "Thought you could use some company," he said, offering her a cold bottle of water. "And maybe a hand with all this paperwork?" Sarah smiled gratefully, accepting both the water and the company. As they worked side by side, their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and shared memories. It was moments like these that made Sarah acutely aware of what she was missing in her marriage. "Remember that time at the family reunion when Anselm tried to barbecue?" Job chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thought he was going to burn down the whole neighborhood." Sarah laughed, the sound echoing in the empty office. "Oh Lord, yes. He was so determined to prove he could do it. Always had to be the best at everything." Her laughter faded, replaced by a wistful smile. "He used to be so different, so full of joy and passion. Now it's all about the next big thing, the next level of success." Job reached out, his hand covering hers. "You deserve better, Sarah. You deserve someone who sees you, who appreciates you." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Sarah felt her heart racing, a mix of fear and excitement coursing through her veins. She knew she should pull away, but found herself leaning closer instead. The spell was broken by the sharp ring of the office phone. Sarah jerked back, guilt washing over her like a tidal wave. She answered the call with shaking hands, grateful for the interruption. That night, as she lay in bed next to a snoring Anselm, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of that moment with Job. The warmth of his hand, the understanding in his eyes, the electric tension between them. She placed a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the gentle kicks of the life growing within her. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. But the seed of temptation had been planted, and it was beginning to take root. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself seeking out Job's company more and more. They would meet for coffee under the guise of discussing church business, or take long walks in the park, ostensibly to plan community outreach events. Each encounter left Sarah feeling both exhilarated and racked with guilt. Anselm, consumed by his grand visions for the ministry, remained oblivious to the growing connection between his wife and his cousin. His absences became more frequent, his late-night returns the norm rather than the exception. One evening, as Sarah prepared dinner alone once again, she received a text from Anselm. "Big meeting running late. Don't wait up." Her heart sank, a familiar mix of disappointment and resentment washing over her. Without thinking, she picked up her phone and texted Job. "Anselm's working late again. Could use some company. Come over?" As soon as she hit send, Sarah regretted her impulsiveness. But it was too late. Within minutes, Job replied, "On my way." When Job arrived, Sarah was a bundle of nerves. They sat on the couch, a respectable distance between them, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. "I shouldn't have asked you to come," Sarah said softly, not meeting his eyes. "This isn't right." Job inched closer, his hand finding hers. "Sarah, look at me," he said gently. When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "What's not right is the way Anselm's been treating you. You deserve to be happy, to be loved." Before Sarah could respond, Job leaned in and kissed her. For a moment she melted into the kiss, all her loneliness and frustration pouring out. But then reality came crashing back. She pulled away abruptly, standing up. "You need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "This can't happen. I'm married, I'm pregnant. This is wrong." Job stood, reaching for her. "Sarah, please. We can figure this out. I love you." "Go," Sarah insisted, pointing to the door. "Just go." After Job left, Sarah collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. She felt lost, torn between her loyalty to Anselm and her growing feelings for Job. The baby kicked inside her, a reminder of the life she and Anselm had created together. As she cried herself to sleep that night, Sarah made a decision. She would tell Anselm everything, confess her feelings for Job, and try to salvage their marriage. They had built this life together, and she owed it to him, to their unborn child, to fight for their family. Little did Sarah know, her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to unimaginable tragedy. The following week passed in a blur of guilt and indecision for Sarah. Every time she resolved to confess to Anselm, her courage failed her. The weight of her secret felt like a physical burden, growing heavier with each passing day. Anselm, for his part, seemed more distant than ever. He was in the final stages of negotiating the ministry's expansion, and his mind was consumed with visions of nationwide influence. On the rare occasions when he was home, he was distracted and irritable, barely acknowledging Sarah's presence. It was on a Friday evening, exactly 1 week after the kiss, that everything came to a head. Anselm had promised to be home early for once, to have a quiet dinner with Sarah. She had spent the afternoon preparing his favorite meal, determined to use this opportunity to come clean and try to reconnect with her husband. As the hours ticked by with no sign of Anselm, Sarah's hope turned to frustration, then to anger. When the clock struck 9 and he still hadn't arrived or called, something inside her snapped. In a moment of weakness and desperation, she picked up her phone and called Job. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I need to see you." Job didn't hesitate. "I'll be right there," he said softly. When Job arrived, Sarah was a mess of conflicting emotions. Part of her knew she should send him away, but a larger part craved the comfort and understanding he offered. As they sat on the couch, Job pulled her into his arms, and Sarah felt herself giving in to the feelings she'd been fighting for so long. "We shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, even as she leaned into his embrace. "I know," Job replied, his voice husky with emotion. "But I can't stay away from you anymore, Sarah. I love you." Their lips met in a passionate kiss, years of pent-up longing and forbidden desire pouring out. In that moment, all thoughts of consequences faded away. They stumbled towards the bedroom, shedding clothes along the way, giving in to their mutual attraction. As they fell onto the bed, tangled in each other's arms, neither of them heard the sound of a key turning in the front door. Anselm Johnson entered his home, his mind still buzzing with the details of the deal he'd just closed. It was late, much later than he'd promised Sarah, and he felt a twinge of guilt. He'd have to make it up to her somehow. As he walked through the living room, he noticed the romantic table setting, now cold and abandoned. Frowning, he called out, "Sarah? Honey, I'm home. I'm so sorry I'm late." There was no response, but as he approached the bedroom, he heard muffled sounds. Concern turned to confusion, then to dawning horror as he pushed open the door. The sight that greeted him would be forever seared into his memory. His pregnant wife entangled with his cousin, both of them naked and breathless. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Sarah and Job froze, their faces masks of shock and guilt. Anselm stood in the doorway, his mind struggling to process the betrayal unfolding before his eyes. Then, with a roar of rage and pain, Anselm lunged forward. "How could you?" he bellowed, his voice barely recognizable. "My own wife, my own blood." Job scrambled off the bed, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Anselm, man, I'm sorry. We didn't mean for this to happen." But Anselm was beyond reason. In a blur of motion, he grabbed Joe the throat, slamming him against the wall. "You're sorry?" he snarled. "I'll make you sorry." Sarah screamed, wrapping herself in a sheet and trying to pull Anselm away. "Stop it, please, Anselm, stop!" In the chaos that followed, punches were thrown, furniture overturned. Sarah begged and pleaded, trying to separate the two men, but her words fell on deaf ears. The room echoed with the sounds of their struggle, punctuated by Sarah's desperate cries. Finally, Job managed to break free. Grabbing his scattered clothes, he bolted from the room. "This is madness," he shouted over his shoulder. "I'm out of here." As the front door slammed shut, an eerie silence fell over the house. Anselm stood in the middle of the wrecked bedroom, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. Sarah cowered in the corner, clutching the sheet around her, tears streaming down her face. "Anselm," she began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, please let me explain." But as Anselm turned to face her, Sarah's words died in her throat. The man looking at her wasn't the charismatic preacher she had married, nor even the ambitious, distant husband of recent months. This was a stranger, his face contorted with a rage she had never seen before. "Explain?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Explain how you betrayed everything we built together, how you made a mockery of our marriage, our ministry, our unborn child." He took a step towards her, and Sarah instinctively backed away, fear coursing through her veins. "Anselm, please," she whimpered. "Think of the baby. We can work this out." For a moment, something flickered in Anselm's eyes, a hint of the man he used to be. But then it was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "No," he said, reaching behind him. "There's only one way to cleanse this sin." As he pulled his hand from behind his back, Sarah's eyes widened in terror. In Anselm's grip was a large kitchen knife, its blade glinting in the dim light of the bedroom. "Anselm, no!" Sarah screamed, scrambling to her feet. But it was too late. With a primal yell, Anselm lunged forward, the knife raised high. Sarah's scream was cut short as the blade plunged into her flesh, again and again and again. The once pristine white sheets of their marital bed turned crimson as Anselm stabbed his pregnant wife 23 times, his face a mask of fury and madness. Each thrust of the knife was accompanied by an anguished cry, a mixture of rage and pain that echoed through the house. When it was over, Anselm stood over Sarah's lifeless body, the bloody knife slipping from his grasp. As the red haze of anger cleared from his vision, the full horror of what he had done crashed over him. "Oh God," he whispered, falling to his knees beside the bed. "What have I done? Sarah? Oh God, Sarah!" But it was too late for regrets. The deed was done, and the once revered Pastor Anselm Johnson had become a murderer. The silence that followed the frenzied attack was deafening. Anselm knelt beside the bed, his hands and clothes soaked in blood, staring in disbelief at the lifeless form of his wife. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, wave after wave of horror washing over him. "This can't be real," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "This can't be happening." But the gruesome scene before him was all too real. Sarah's once vibrant face was now pale and still, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The sheet she had clutched so desperately was now a sodden crimson mess. And their unborn child, the innocent life that had been growing within her, was gone too, victim to Anselm's uncontrolled rage. As the shock began to wear off, panic set in. Anselm's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of his actions. He was a murderer. He had killed his wife and unborn child. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was now in ruins. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone. His finger hovered over the emergency call button, but he couldn't bring himself to press it. How could he explain this? How could the great Pastor Anselm Johnson admit to such a heinous act? In that moment of indecision, survival instinct kicked in. He had to cover this up. He had to find a way out. Moving as if in a trance, Anselm began to clean up. He stripped the bloody sheets from the bed, stuffing them into a garbage bag along with his stained clothes. He scrubbed the floor, erasing the evidence of his brutal act. As he worked, his mind churned, formulating a plan. He would report Sarah missing. Yes, that's what he would do. He'd say she had gone out for a late-night craving run. Pregnant women did that, right? And never returned. He'd play the part of the distraught husband, rallying the community to search for his beloved wife. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, Anselm Johnson stood in his spotless bedroom, looking every inch the respected pastor in a fresh suit. The evidence of his crime was bagged and hidden in the trunk of his car, ready to be disposed of at the first opportunity. Taking a deep breath, he dialed 911. "Please, you have to help me," he said, his voice cracking with well-practiced distress. "My wife is missing. She's pregnant. Please, you have to find her." The wheels were set in motion. Within hours, the disappearance of Sarah Johnson was the talk of the town. News vans crowded the street outside the evangelical ministry of His Holiness, eager to catch a glimpse of the distraught Pastor Johnson. Anselm played his part to perfection. He stood before the cameras, his eyes red-rimmed, pleading for information about his missing wife. "Sarah, if you can hear this, please come home," he said, his voice breaking. "Whatever's happened, we can work it out. I love you. Please, just come back to us." The community rallied around their beloved pastor. Search parties were organized, flyers were distributed, and prayer vigils were held nightly at the church. Anselm was at the center of it all, the picture of a devoted husband desperate to find his wife. But as days turned into weeks with no sign of Sarah, whispers began to circulate. Why hadn't the police found any leads? Why were there no witnesses, no security camera footage of Sarah leaving the house that night? Detective Angela Benson of the LAPD was assigned to the case. A veteran of the force with a keen eye for detail, she sensed something was off from the beginning. As she delved deeper into the investigation, inconsistencies in Anselm's story began to emerge. "Mr. Johnson," she said during one of their many interviews, "you say Sarah left the house around 10 p.m. for a craving run. But your neighbor's security camera shows no cars leaving your driveway after 8 p.m. that night. Can you explain that?" Anselm's carefully constructed facade began to crack. I must have been mistaken about the time," he stammered. You know how it is, Detective. When you're worried sick, time seems to blur. But Detective Benson wasn't buying it. She began to dig deeper, interviewing church members, neighbors, anyone who might have information about the Johnsons'-Deck relationship. It was during one of these interviews that she struck gold. Lena, Sarah's best friend, finally broke down and revealed the tensions in the Johnson marriage. Sarah was unhappy, she confessed tearfully. Anselm was always working, always focused on the ministry. And then there was Job. The mention of Job Johnson set off alarm bells for Detective Benson. When questioned, Job initially tried to stick to the story Anselm had concocted. But faced with the possibility of being implicated in Sarah's disappearance, he crumbled. We had an affair, Job admitted, his face in his hands. Anselm walked in on us that night. He was furious. I ran. I shouldn't have left her there with him. Oh God, what have I done? Armed with this new information, Detective Benson obtained a warrant to search the Johnson home. Despite Anselm's meticulous cleaning, forensic experts found traces of blood in the bedroom. DNA analysis confirmed it was Sarah's. The net was closing in on Pastor Anselm Johnson. On a sunny Sunday morning, just as Anselm was preparing to deliver a sermon on forgiveness and redemption, Detective Benson walked into the church. The congregation watched in stunned silence as she approached the pulpit, handcuffs at the ready. Anselm Johnson, she said, her voice echoing through the hushed sanctuary, you're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Johnson and your unborn child. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Anselm's carefully constructed world came crashing down. The mask of the grieving husband slipped away, revealing the tortured face of a man consumed by guilt and fear. I'm sorry, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry. The fall of Pastor Anselm Johnson sent shockwaves through Los Angeles and beyond. The man who had once been hailed as a beacon of faith and morality was now revealed as a murderer. The evangelical ministry of His Holiness, once a thriving community, was left in tatters, its congregations struggling to reconcile their faith with the horrific actions of their leader. In the months that followed, as Anselm awaited trial, the full story of that fateful night emerged. The pressure of maintaining a perfect image, the strain of building a religious empire, the betrayal of trust, all had contributed to the perfect storm that resulted in tragedy. The trial of Pastor Anselm Johnson became a media sensation. Every day, the courthouse was surrounded by crowds, some praying for Anselm's soul, others demanding justice for Sarah and her unborn child. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution painted a damning picture of a man driven to murderous rage by jealousy and the fear of losing his carefully cultivated image. Anselm's defense team tried to argue temporary insanity, claiming that the shock of discovering his wife's infidelity had caused him to snap. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a guilty verdict. As the judge pronounced his sentence, life in prison without possibility of parole, Anselm stood silently, a shadow of the charismatic preacher he once was. His final statement to the court was a far cry from the impassioned sermons he used to deliver. I failed, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I failed Sarah, I failed my unborn child, I failed my congregation, and I failed God. There's no forgiveness for what I've done, no redemption. I can only pray that someday, somehow, I can make amends for the lives I've destroyed. 5 years after the shocking murder that rocked Los Angeles, the evangelical ministry of His Holiness stands empty, its doors chained shut. The once pristine white walls are now covered in graffiti, a stark reminder of how far the mighty can fall. The community that once rallied around Pastor Anselm Johnson has scattered, many of its members struggling to reconcile their faith with the horrific actions of their former leader. Some have found new churches, while others have turned away from organized religion altogether, their trust shattered by Anselm's betrayal. In a maximum security prison on the outskirts of the city, Anselm Johnson spends his days in quiet reflection. The charismatic preacher who once commanded the attention of thousands is now a shell of his former self. His days filled with regret and futile attempts at redemption. Job Johnson, racked with guilt over his role in the tragedy, has left Los Angeles. Last anyone heard, he was working as a janitor in a small town in Oregon, trying to atone for his actions by living a life of humble service. Detective Angela Benson, the tenacious investigator who cracked the case, has become something of a local hero. She often speaks at law enforcement conferences, using the Johnson case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming innocence based on a person's status or reputation. And what of Sarah? The vibrant young woman whose life was cut tragically short is remembered through a small foundation set up in her name. The Sarah Johnson Memorial Fund provides support to victims of domestic violence, a bittersweet legacy of a life ended too soon. The story of Pastor Anselm Johnson and the fall of the evangelical ministry of His Holiness has become a modern parable, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the corrosive nature of secrets, and the devastating consequences of betrayal. In the end, the tragedy serves as a stark reminder that even those who claim to speak for God are fallible, human, and capable of the darkest acts. It's a lesson that the people of Los Angeles won't soon forget, a wound that may never fully heal. As the sun sets over the city, casting long shadows across the abandoned church, one can almost hear the echoes of Sarah's final screams, a chilling reminder of the night when faith turned to betrayal, and a man of God became a murderer. The tale of Anselm and Sarah Johnson will be told and retold for years to come, a modern-day tragedy that shook a city to its core and left an indelible mark on all who heard it. It stands as a grim testament to the complexities of human nature, the fragility of trust, and the terrible price of betrayal. In the end, perhaps the only solace to be found is in the hope that from this darkness, others might learn. That in the face of temptation, they might choose differently, that in moments of rage they might find restraint, and that in the aftermath of tragedy, they might find the strength to rebuild, to heal, and to move forward. For in the story of Anselm and Sarah Johnson, we see reflected our own capacity for both great good and terrible evil. It serves as a mirror, challenging us to examine our own hearts, our own choices, and the consequences of our actions. And so, as Los Angeles continues to grapple with the aftermath of this shocking crime, the question remains, what lessons will we take from this tragedy? How will we ensure that such a horrific event never happens again? The answers to these questions may well determine the future of faith, trust, and community in this city of angels. As night falls, and the city lights flicker to life, the abandoned evangelical ministry of His Holiness stands as a silent sentinel, a stark reminder of the thin line between devotion and obsession, between love and possession, between righteousness and sin. It is a testament to the enduring power of truth and the ultimate futility of deception. In the end, the story of Pastor Anselm Johnson is more than just a sensational true crime tale. It is a deeply human story of ambition, betrayal, and the terrible consequences of losing one's way. It is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, justice can prevail, and that no matter how well hidden, the truth will always eventually come to light. As Los Angeles continues to heal, as new leaders rise to fill the void left by Anselm's fall, and as the community slowly rebuilds its shattered faith, one thing remains certain. The echoes of that tragic night will continue to resonate, a somber reminder of the price of betrayal and the indomitable human spirit that somehow finds a way to persevere, even in the face of unimaginable horror. And so the story of Pastor Anselm Johnson, Sarah, and the evangelical ministry of His Holiness becomes part of the city's lore, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones, a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers lurk not in the shadows, but in the hearts of those we trust the most. 10 years have passed since the shocking murder that tore apart the evangelical ministry of His Holiness and shook the foundations of faith in Los Angeles. The passage of time has done little to erase the memory of that fateful night when Pastor Anselm Johnson took the lives of his pregnant wife Sarah and their unborn child. The once grand church building, a symbol of hope and redemption, now stands as a haunting reminder of human frailty. Its walls, once gleaming white, are weathered and stained. The steeple that once reached proudly towards the heavens now leans precariously, as if bowing under the weight of the tragedy it witnessed. Anselm Johnson, once the charismatic leader of thousands, spends his days in a small prison cell. The man who once commanded attention with his booming voice and magnetic presence is now a shadow of his former self. His hair has grayed, his shoulders slump, and his eyes, once alight with passion, now hold only the dull sheen of regret. In a rare interview granted to a true crime documentary series, Anselm speaks haltingly of his life behind bars. Every day, he says, his voice barely above a whisper, I wake up and for a moment I forget. Then it all comes crashing back, what I did, who I was, what I lost. It's a life sentence in more ways than one. The community that once rallied around the Johnsons has struggled to heal. Many former members of the congregation speak of a crisis of faith that followed the murder. How could we have been so blind? Asks former church elder Michael Thompson. We thought we knew him, we trusted him, and all the while. Some found solace in other churches, while others turned away from organized religion altogether. A small group led by Lena, Sarah's best friend, started a support group for those grappling with the aftermath of the tragedy. We're trying to make sense of the senseless, Lena explains, to find a way forward when everything we believed in was shattered. Job Johnson, whose affair with Sarah set the tragic events in motion, has become a cautionary tale in his own right. After years of substance abuse and depression, he found a measure of peace working with at-risk youth. I can't change what happened, he says, his eyes filled with unshed tears. But maybe I can help prevent others from making the same mistakes. Detective Angela Benson, now retired from the force, has written a book about the case. Breaking the Halo, the true story of Pastor Anselm Johnson, has become a bestseller, offering insight into the investigation that brought a respected religious leader to justice. It's a reminder, Benson says, that we must always look beyond the surface, question our assumptions, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we least suspect. The Sarah Johnson Memorial Fund, established in the wake of the tragedy, has grown into a powerful force for change. It not only provides support to victims of domestic violence, but also funds research into the psychological factors that lead to such crimes. We couldn't save Sarah, says the fund's director, but we're determined to save others in her name. As for the unborn child, whose life was cut short before it could begin, a small memorial garden stands on what was once the church grounds. A single statue of a pregnant woman, her face turned towards the sky, serves as a poignant reminder of innocence lost. The story of Anselm and Sarah Johnson has become more than just a sensational crime. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of transparency in religious institutions, and the devastating consequences of betrayal. Law enforcement agencies now use it as a case study in domestic violence investigations, while seminaries incorporate it into their ethics curriculum. Yet, even as the years pass and the sharp edges of grief begin to dull, the questions remain. How could a man dedicated to God commit such a heinous act? How thin is the line between devotion and obsession, between love and possession? And how can a community rebuild its faith after such a profound betrayal? Perhaps there are no easy answers. The legacy of the Johnson tragedy is a complex tapestry of pain, resilience, and slow healing. It serves as a stark reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is a path forward, not to forget, but to learn, to grow, and to strive for a better future. As the sun sets over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the abandoned church, the city continues to grapple with the echoes of that tragic night. The story of Pastor Anselm Johnson and the fall of the evangelical ministry of His Holiness has become a part of the city's lore, a cautionary tale whispered to remind us all of the fragility of trust and the enduring power of truth. In the end, perhaps the most profound legacy of this tragedy is the reminder it provides that in our darkest moments, when faith falters and trust is broken, it is our shared humanity, our capacity for compassion, forgiveness, and resilience that lights the way forward. And in that light, we find the strength to face our demons, to rebuild what was lost, and to forge a path towards healing and hope.